everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting. My name is Matthew Winter. I'm the Reasonable Faith Chapter Director for Helsinki, Finland, and it's my honor to welcome our guest tonight, Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Gary Habermas is a professor at Liberty University. He's one of the foremost scholars, if not the foremost scholar on the resurrection, and one of the most well-known apologists of today. So thank you so much, Dr. Habermas, for being with us tonight.
Glad to be with you.
So before we get into the minimal facts argument and just talk about what that is, do you want to just explain how you got into this topic of the resurrection and why you've continued to do it for your whole career?
Sure. I do. A number of talk show hosts and other podcasts, they'll say to me something like, "I'll bet you got into this because there were a lot of doubters, or you wanted to help doubters because we noticed your books on doubt and so on." And I'll say, well, I'll tell you what, that would be nice if I could be that altruistic to say I was doing it for the world. That would be a nice thing, but it didn't start that way. I went through what was for me a horrible, well, 10 years straight and on and off for another 10 years. So 20 years of doubt, and some of it got pretty strenuous. And when I first started doubting, some Christian friends came alongside of me and said, why don't you try this evidence, or why don't you try that evidence? And there were a lot of good ones. I mean, somebody would want me to try the reliability of the New Testament, and somebody would say, look at archaeology. And, there's always those out there who are going to say, look at creation. Anymore, it would be more like intelligent design or fine tuning. And I found a lot of those were very intriguing and had good evidence. But I never thought that any of them sort of tied the bow on the gift. I just didn't think that any of them finished it off. They left too much open. And there were a lot of evidences that were good as evidences, but not good as Christian evidences. And then one day it dawned on me that if the resurrection of Christ could be sustained, that could be the event which sort of ties the bow on the whole thing, as well as if you have a resurrection, that would presumably, it doesn't take a whole lot of rational work to think that you could really get to some other views from that. I mean, if that's true, why Jesus and the world religions? What about what he had to say? Isn't there a direct tie to the resurrection and afterlife and so on? So I settled down and I thought, okay, this may really be it. As to why I've never gotten off this subject, first of all, I want to make sure I've covered all the bases, but so many people who want evidence feel the same way. They think they need to go through resurrection, and I think they're right. But on the other side, there are a lot of attacks, and I'm doing this large magnum opus on the resurrection, and I've got the largest book in print is on naturalistic theories. It has about 250 pages. Most of them are down around 20 or 30 pages. This magnum opus I'm working on has 1,100 pages on naturalistic theories. So that's why you have to stay with it. There's always something coming up, always something to refute and treat. So that's a little rundown, and I've never left it, and it's always excited me, and it's always provided a path out to the factual side of doubt and for afterlife and everything else. So I'm happy with that.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, you're the one who coined the minimal facts argument. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the phrase and actually applying it to the resurrection. Actually, what a lot of people don't know is this is the way critical scholars do New Testament studies. What I mean is, if you're a critical New Testament scholar and you don't think the resurrection is reliable, if you don't think the New Testament's reliable, the way you're probably going to go after it is, what would I know about Jesus? Or what would I know about the resurrection if I only use the materials that everybody's going to grant? So they, in effect, are working with the minimal sort of case. So I started doing it on my doctoral dissertation way back in 1975. And by the way, that thing is being republished in just a few months by Lexham Press. They're redoing the dissertation with a new introduction of where are we on resurrection since 1975. So it's just a topic that never quits. Everybody wants it, and if you don't like it, everybody goes against it. So
Yeah. Yeah. So, how does the minimal facts argument, for those who are maybe new to this, how does it work, and why do you think it's a good method of showing the resurrection to be the most likely explanation of the data?
well, on the surface, the minimal facts argument uses the smallest body of applicable material, and you could always go smaller, but you can make the resurrection work with the smallest pieces of data that are allowed by even atheist New Testament scholars, of whom there's a goodly number. There's a goodly number of atheist New Testament scholars, agnostic New Testament scholars, Jewish New Testament scholars who have remained Jewish, but their field of study is New Testament. And it's amazing because I almost would rather deal with those people than with. So, sometimes conservative Christians are more cantankerous. Sometimes they're more argumentative. They're more whatever. And they want to yell at you for not using the whole New Testament and everything else. And I'm trying to say, hey, look, I'm not telling you how much I use and don't use. I'm telling you what we can get away with. I'm telling you how small the territory is. So the minimal facts, by definition, are those facts which are allowed or used because they're multiply evidenced. Now that's not the same as multiply attested. That's not like a multiple attestation. But there's a lot of evidences. If you have a minimal fact, whichever one you want to use, a whole lot of facts are going to come to its aid. And that's the reason for number two, or B, is that everybody allows these facts. In fact, I have a list. Some of these things are very, very minute. But if you list every little thing that would count for the 6 minimal facts I use, plus I often use the empty tomb, it is not a minimal fact by my reckoning because it's not an almost unanimously accepted fact, but it is as well evidenced as the minimal facts. So if you use the 6+1, what I call 6+1, 6 minimal facts plus the empty tomb, there are over 100 considerations in their favor, not just citing a verse that a Christian likes that critics don't like. There's over 100 pieces of information evidencing those 7 facts, and with that 100 being accepted by critical scholars. It's an amazing amount of material. That's why nobody argues. So all the facts are in its favor, and everybody allows it. That's the 2 criteria that allow minimal facts. I sometimes call it the lowest common denominator approach. So there you have it. If the New Testament's inspired, fantastic. If it's not, or if it's the worst you can imagine, if it's Rudolf Bultmann's New Testament, fine. You still get a resurrection. That's my argument.
Okay, and so you mentioned the 6+1, and I guess the 1 is the empty tomb. So
Correct.
what are the other 6?
The 6 I would use, and my number goes up and down. I might use 3, 5, 6, and you go, why do you change the numbers? Do the critics give up on them? Not at all. I use numbers because the smaller number, the better. And critics usually will give you 20. They'll give you 15. So I'll say, no. This sounds funny, but in a way, I'm like saying, you're way too conservative. I don't need your 15 as an atheist New Testament scholar. I don't need your 15. I could do it with 12. And there was a program here years ago in America, Name That Tune, and contestants would try to guess the name of a song with the lowest possible notes. And somebody would say, I can name that song in 3 notes. And to underbid that person, you'd have to say 2 notes. And they'll go, okay, here you go. Boom, boom. And you got to name the song. Well, it's sort of like that. The lower the number I use, the stronger the case is. But nobody will only give me those facts. They all give me more. So why did I go lower? Just to show them you can do it with the lower case. It truly is lowest common denominator. Then, so they would be, Jesus died by crucifixion. As a result, afterwards, the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus. They had experiences which they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Here's the one that's got the most evidence most recently. Number 3, these events were taught very, very early. They were taught immediately afterwards. Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament scholar from Germany, says that these things were proclaimed as soon as it occurred. Whatever these experiences were, which is fact 2, they were proclaimed, which is fact 3, early. 4, lives were transformed radically, even to the point of being willing to die. And according to the earliest data we have, of the big 4, the main 4 folks at the beginning, most influential, Peter and John from the 12, and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, who are also called apostles. And from those 4, we have first century evidence of the martyrdom of 3 of the 4. And a second century reference, a lot of Christians don't know this. They just think John got off, John got away, or John, they couldn't kill him, something. But there is a second century source for the martyrdom of John. So it's still early. But we have 3 first century sources for the martyrdoms of Peter, James, and Paul. And so that fourth point is that their lives are transformed to the point of being willing to die. And 5 and 6 kind of go together, but they're different. 2 skeptics who were unbelievers before became believers after they met the risen Jesus, and that would be Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, formerly skeptics. So crucifixion, real experiences, early, transformed lives, Paul, James, and let's throw on the evidence alone, let's throw the empty tomb in there. Not everybody agrees with it. When I say not everybody agrees with it, they're still around 75% on the empty tomb. But these other ones I'm using, the other 6, we're in the 90s. We're in the 90s of skeptical scholars.
So when you were saying that this went back right from the beginning, I think a lot of people who don't know the Bible or haven't really studied much about the historicity of the New Testament probably think this was just corrupted over time and it's through legendary development. So what kind of evidence do we have that this goes back right from the beginning after Jesus' crucifixion?
Excellent question. And the answer that I'll give is one of the main reasons why these atheists, Bart Ehrman in our country, Gerrit Ludemann in Germany, Jewish scholars, both of these deceased, but Jewish scholars, Pinchas Lapid, who is a non-Christian Jew with a PhD in New Testament from Tübingen in Germany, and Geza Vermesh, non-Christian Jew who taught Jewish history for years at Oxford University. They're going to concede these things because here's the key. In the New Testament epistles in particular, not only, but chiefly in the New Testament epistles, there are dozens of little, what are called creedal formulations. There are dozens of little snippets of early preaching. So start with that. They're early snippets. How do you know they're early snippets? Well, because when Paul's epistles first start getting published, and critics will give you 7 of these, they will grant 7 right off the bat. And in these earliest 7 epistles, 1 Thessalonians being the earliest, it just plus 20 years after the cross, you have a very high Christology, Jesus called Lord. Lord was the New Testament translation of the Old Testament Yahweh, or Jehovah. And it appears that way in the earliest book, First Thessalonians. However, in First Thessalonians and the other Pauline epistles that everybody accepts that come right after that, it's not only a very high Christology, they all talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, what we call the facts of the gospel, the factual side, there's a commitment side, but the factual side is always said to be the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Deity, death, resurrection, over and over. Well, scholars started wondering, why does this fully developed Christology start in 50 AD in First Thessalonians? And there's these little tiny snippets. So they said, all right, well, those are little preaching points from earlier, but you're already at 20. People blame Mark for being 40 years old, 40 years later. I'll tell you what, Mark at plus 40 is earlier than virtually any other religious piece in virtually any other religion. We could do that in detail if you want, but First Thessalonians cuts the distance in half to 20. And there's already a fully developed Christology. And these sayings, 80% of these dozens of early creeds are about the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. They're about the gospel. So you go, well, okay, good. So that got us down to 20. How do you get earlier than 20? Because they were around before the epistle. To make a long story short, critics think that, take Bart Ehrman, take Gerrit Ludemann, New Testament atheists. They date these early creeds to between the crucifixion and Paul's conversion. Many of them go in that early period. So they're called pre-Pauline creeds. Bart Ehrman says that the earliest creeds probably came from Jerusalem, probably in existence before Paul's conversion. Okay, time out. When was Paul converted? 2 to 3 years after the cross. Everyone's on board there. So within 2 to 3 years, these creeds come from Jerusalem. Paul knew them. In fact, Bart Ehrman says Paul records more creeds than anybody. Of course, he wrote more books than anybody, but Paul records more creeds than anybody. And Bart Ehrman says they were probably all in existence before Paul was even converted. That's why he was so ticked. He knew what they believed and he thought it was heresy. Now, last connection. All right, so we got a bunch of little things in there early. Who cares? It's a bunch of hogwash. It could be hearsay. It could be anything but truth. Good. How do we know it's fact? Because in Galatians, a universally accepted book by critics, Paul makes 2 trips to Jerusalem. One in Galatians 1, one in Galatians 2. He makes these 2 trips to Jerusalem, and the first time he met with Peter and Paul for 15 days. The second time John is there, Peter, Paul, and James. Then John. So that makes 4. That's the big 4. And Paul said, I went back to test the gospel. I want to make sure that the gospel I was preaching is the same as the gospel they were preaching. You say, well, okay, so what's your conclusion? And in Galatians chapter 2, verse 2, Paul said he gave them the gospel. And Paul said right after that, they added nothing to me. Now, not only did they add nothing to Paul, in verse 9, they give Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. They lay hands on Paul and Barnabas and say, you guys take the gospel to the Gentiles. So we're sure about the gospel. We're on the same page. Blessings on you. You go there and we'll stay here and talk to the Jews. So the point is, the high points would be earliest book, First Thessalonians. Very high Christology in that book. The creeds, dozens of them, are much earlier. How much earlier? Pre-Pauline. How do you know all that? Because Paul defines the gospel several times. Take Romans 10:9, which is a pre-Pauline creed, by the way. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. That's pre-Pauline. 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, the most commented on creed of all. And Paul goes back and confirms all this with those disciples, and he gives the date for it. He said, first of all, I came to Christ. So that's Damascus. That's 2 or 3 years. And he said, 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem. So you say, how do we know it's that early? 5 to 6 years after the cross, they're discussing the facts of the gospel, and they're all agreeing. Now, you could say, well, the creeds could be later. Well, most people don't think so. But I just want to make one last point. It's not the creeds per se that we're after. It's the data confirmed in the creeds. It's the data that I could care less if Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water, Jack fell down, and that's a secular creed. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Those are secular creeds. I don't care if Jack and Jill and row, row, row your boat were together as a creed. I want to know that there was a Jack and Jill that did something before the creed started. And that's what Paul confirmed in Galatians. So it's the content. That's why it's not a myth. That's why it's not hearsay. That's why it's early. And Paul ties it all up and puts a little bow on it, and we've got the gospel, deity, death, resurrection. Sorry for that long explanation, but that's the reason for the change and dating all this material to pre-Christian origin. I'm sorry, pre-Pauline, pre-Paul becoming a Christian origin.
So basically, with that, we can rule out legendary development completely, right?
Yeah, except one thing I want to make plain. A lot of Christian apologists, you still see this phrase a lot. This is too soon for myth to develop. No, that's not it. Yeah, but that's what you're saying, right? First Thessalonians is too soon for myth. Okay, here's what I'm saying. It's very, very soon. But I'm not saying it's too soon for a myth to develop. Here's how long it takes a myth to develop. I talk to you on the phone, let's say, 2 days ago. You get off the phone, and for better or worse, you meant to mislead or you didn't meant to mislead, but whatever, you told a group of people something I did not say as if I said it. How long did it take? Well, it might take 5 minutes. It might take 2 hours. But that false story circulates in 2 hours. Nothing is too soon for a false story to circulate. So that's not the point. But the point is, at a very, very, very early date, Garrett Lundeman again, right after the cross, at a very early date, here's the key. They reported the data, and the data were confirmed by the people who saw it. Now, someone who doesn't hear me the right way says, oh, you mean in the Gospels where they all confirmed it? Okay, I think there's good confirmation of the Gospels, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about Paul's trip to Jerusalem to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. He got it from Peter and James initially, Peter, James, and Paul. And then a few years later, he went back and he got it from Peter still there, James is still there, of course, Paul is still there, and John is there now. And they affirmed. In fact, here's where you get it. You get this affirmation, Galatians 1 and 2. A key verse is 1 Corinthians 15:11, right after the creed. 1 Corinthians 15:11, he got done talking about their appearances. He talked about Jesus appearing to Peter, Jesus appearing to James, Jesus appearing to 500, Jesus appearing to the 12, Jesus appearing to all the apostles. And then he says this, whether it is I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. Whether it is I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. So the key here is the gospel data were confirmed by the earliest eyewitnesses. That's the key right there. It was very early, but that's the key.
Okay, so let's take on one of your other minimal facts. And this one I'm always surprised that so many skeptics grant, because it seems to be a lot that they're granting. And that's that the disciples had experiences that they thought were the risen Jesus. Why do even skeptical scholars accept that fact?
Because the earliest Greek and these early creedal reports that get us back, according to Ehrman, according to Ludemann, a number of these go back to before Paul's conversion. That means in between the cross and 2 to 3 years later on his famous trip to Damascus. During that meeting, at that early time, the reports say not just that he arose, they say, we saw him. We saw him. For example, 1 Corinthians 11, over and over again, the word is arao in Greek, and the arao means to see, but it can mean to see a physical object, or it can be something as non-physical as we say it today. We go, oh, I see. And all we mean is, I understand. Go, well, okay, so it could mean either physical sight or non-physical sight. That's correct. What does it usually mean? It usually means physical sight. But there's more than that. The Greek word, the form of the Greek, shows you that Jesus was making himself known to the apostles. Jesus is the one, they didn't wish it and see it. The Greek says Jesus showed himself. When they say he was seen by Jesus, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, buried, rose again the third day, and appeared to Peter and the 12. That appearing in the Greek, everybody allows, that word means Jesus showed himself. So the reason we're getting back to the language of sight is because the Greek at its very base point is a showing of somebody to somebody else. If I were to say, yeah, you were all gathered there in Helsinki, and I walked into the room, I showed myself, but the initiation, the language is on the me walking in, not the you thinking I was there and found out I wasn't. Not you having a dream. It's on me walking in. And so they all admit that it's the language of sight. And whatever you have to deal with, you may not buy it, but you have to allow that that's what they were saying. The eyewitnesses agreed they were appeared to. So.
Okay, so maybe we can just talk about some alternative theories to the resurrection. So I've heard that most of these haven't been abandoned, but take, for example, hallucinations. Why not think that those experiences the disciples had were just some kind of hallucinations and subjective visions?
Yeah, if you're going to pick a naturalistic theory, that's probably the way to go. But you used a little phrase there. You said, I know these are not so common anymore. These data that I call the minimal data are so important and so strong that critics have almost given up being a champion of one particular naturalistic theory, whichever one you want. More often today, they will say, well, I'll take any of them. I'll take any of them. They're better than resurrection. I think the reason they say I'll take any of them is I can't take any of them, if that makes sense. What they mean is I'll take all of them, but I don't want to take one of them, because as a guy in a debate, as an atheist said to me in a debate one time, he said, a professor, he said, you're starting to get me angry. And I said, why? And he said, because you're trying to force me to pick a theory. And then if I pick one, you're going to bring all these facts on it. And he literally said, then you'll have me in a corner I'll have nowhere to go, and I won't like that. And I said, time out, time out. I'm a supernaturalist. I'm going to tell you my theory. Jesus was raised from the dead. You're a naturalist. He said, yes. Then you should be willing to, if you disbelieve this event, just don't say, I don't like it. That's a very small comment. I don't like it. Don't tell me you don't like it. You're a naturalist. Tell me why you don't like it. And he repeated, you're starting to get me mad. I don't like being in a corner. And I said, well, look, if the best your view can do is paint you in a corner, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, let's do hallucinations. There are several major problems. On my website, if anybody wants this, on my website, I have an article um, that has different forms of hallucination theory. And I think it's 19 total refutations based on which theory, which direction you want to go. A lot of refutations, but some of the big ones would be these. In the literature, I've written with, worked with, researched with a bunch of different scholars. One that I published with in the Irish Theological Quarterly is a medical doctor who did a literature review, and there is no documented case of a group seeing hallucination in the known medical literature. I think that goes back 25 or 30 something years, but no empirical data. The other guy is a clinical psychologist, PhD. He's a clinical psychologist. He did a psych review, and there's no documented case of a documented hallucination appearing to a group. Beyond that there's no empirical data. The definition of an hallucination makes it an internal event. It is as internal to me as me describing a dream I had last night. You didn't share that. I don't share your dreams. I don't share your hallucinations. You don't share mine. So it's the very concept of hallucination. It's the lack of empirical data. Another problem is if the evidence for the empty tomb is strong, and it is, there are over 20 reasons to accept the empty tomb. And here's the key: using only critical material and methods. Using only critical material and methods, there's more than 20 reasons to believe the tomb was empty. And I tell my grad students, I'll say, is hallucination an empty tomb theory or a closed or a full tomb theory? And they'll say, well, it's a full tomb theory because there's going to be a body in the tomb. Exactly, but there's no body in the tomb. Well, maybe somebody stole it. Yeah, now look what you just did. You just said that the hallucination theory is inadequate. You brought another theory in. Do you want to go with stolen body? No, I don't want to go there. That's a lousy view. Then you're right, it is, but that's one more reason you can't hold hallucination. So, like I said, that's there for everybody to see. There are, I think it's 19 refutations of hallucination. The hallucination is held by people, by the way, people who hold explanations. Garrett Ludeman holds hallucination. I think he's 75, 76-ish. People who hold specific naturalistic theories are usually elderly scholars. Now, what does elderly mean? It means they used to make those things work decades ago, but the younger ones don't do it. Why don't they? They could be as skeptical as you want to be. Why don't they take the theories? Because they get pushed in a corner with them and they get shot down. So if the data are that good, there's a problem for one and all of the naturalistic theories. So if you're going to use one, it's probably hallucination, but very few take any of them anymore per capita.
So I feel like what I'm hearing is that essentially, like atheist scholars or just non-Christians in general, they don't not accept the resurrection for New Testament or historical criteria reasons. What would you say is the reason that they don't accept the resurrection?
To say it colloquially, they don't want to get married to Jesus. What I mean is, the way I introduce a story would be this: if you and I were best friends, And I just happen to think marriage is the best way to live. I've had a great marriage, so I think everybody should be married. Just a subjective view. But you're my best friend and you're single. But because you're single and I think you should be blessed, I want to introduce you to somebody and I want you to accept a blind date. And you go, well, I hate blind dates. But because we're best friends, I'll try it. And next time I see you, it's a month from now, and you say, man, this person is fantastic. I've had a great experience with this person. I'll go, good, great, great. Can I be your best man? And you go, time out. There is a big difference between thinking somebody's really, really cool and I want to spend the rest of my life with them. Even if I wouldn't mind spending the rest of my life with them, I'm allergic to commitments. And so being convinced it's the best way to go is not the same as marrying that person. And in the New Testament, you have the facts of at least the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But the other side is you got to get married. You got to say, I do to Jesus. And I say get married. That is the Greek. The Greek does it's believe and have faith and trust. But the Greek doesn't mean I believe in this historical figure or that historical figure, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It's not a mere belief in facts. It's a commitment to. The Greek words pistis, pistuo, the Greek words for believe in the New Testament mean to jump in with both feet. You don't go swimming by putting your toes in the water. You go swimming by going in. And that's what belief is. Belief is an all-in thing. So I think the reason they don't want to do it most of the time, without even knowing why they're not doing it, when you start talking to these folks, they don't read the data. But they don't want it because they've decided ahead of time they don't want to get married. And you know what's an interesting little story is that in the Bible, God is both in the Old and New Testament. God is pictured as the groom, and first of all, the children of Israel in the Old Testament, the church in the New Testament are always called the bride. And interestingly, if the church or the Jewish people go apostate, the biblical language is the language of adultery. Isn't that amazing? You committed adultery. I did not. No, but they mean spiritual adultery. You got hooked on an idol, but you were married to Jehovah. What's with this idol? It's always in terms of of marriage. And so for those reasons, the Greek word, that picture in the Bible, I say that person doesn't want to get married. And they get increasingly angry oftentimes when you press it. When you say, well, if you don't have the facts, I mean, if you can't refute the facts, why don't you do something? Because I don't want to do something. That's the reason. Not because, and they'll pretend like they don't have the facts. They'll almost always pretend that it's factual. And when you answer the facts, you wonder why they're not willing to commit. And then you realize it's the commitment they don't like. I'm sorry, I'm giving you really longer answers than normal. I'm sorry about that, but you're asking some very detailed questions. You're doing a great job.
No, I appreciate it. That's a very good answer, I think. So I think we'll get into Q&A soon. So if you'd like to ask Dr. Habermas a question, you can either write it in the chat or just talk to him directly. But before I do that, I have some pre-submitted questions from some people in the group. So maybe I'll ask you some of those first.
Sure.
So Matthias was asking, what are the reasons to accept that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea? Because some people like John Dominic Crossan, for example, they'll say that, he was probably just thrown in like a mass grave or something and eaten by dogs, right? So why think that the Romans would have allowed for him to have like the Jewish burial instead of like go with the rest of the executed people type of burial?
Yeah, that's good. First of all, this doesn't prove anything, but the fact that almost nobody follows John Dominic Crossan of that view shows you that something might be wrong. The fact that he doesn't have a head count on his side doesn't prove he's wrong. He could be right with very few scholars. But the fact that people who want the data don't go in that direction tells you that they think the data go somewhere else. Okay, so where else do the data go? Josephus is a great test case here because he was according to the Jews, he was a Jewish historian, but he was a turncoat because when Jerusalem was conquered, Josephus became the court historian, and he actually went to Rome and lived as a historian in Rome. He was adopted by the Romans. And Josephus even tells us not only do the Jews have a strict enough view that bodies shouldn't be cremated, bodies should be buried, bodies shouldn't be left out in the air, bodies should be properly buried. Josephus specifically says that when the Jewish people were crucified in Jerusalem by the Romans, so here you got the Jewish turned Roman historian talking about what the Romans did. He says they allowed the Jews to be buried. And we also have sources. I'm doing a review on a very technical book on crucifixion right now. And generally the rule was you give the body to the family if the family wants it. That's like that's Mediterranean. That's just not, Christians or Jews. But Josephus specifically says even the bodies of the crucified were buried. We have several crucifixion victims. One was named Yohanan, but there's others now. There are the bones of a few crucifixion victims who were nailed. But the point is they were buried. So Josephus is the main source there, but deeper than that is the Jewish belief in burial. And Romans didn't want to rock the boat on this one because they didn't want an uprising of angry, sword-wielding Jewish warriors. They didn't want an uprising. See, Pilate finally did get Pilate got, the Romans in Rome, they were very upset with him, but nobody wanted to make the guys in Rome angry. And you don't make them angry by keeping everything calm. So you do it the way they want to do it.
Okay, great. Now I have one more question from Matthias. Why accept that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is historical? Because it's a pretty lofty claim. We have appearances to the disciples, to the brother of Jesus, James. We also have the appearances to the 500. So why accept something like that as being historical?
Okay, a couple points here, but I'm glad we already have the former background because I'm going to piggyback on that. That creed is in a book. 1 Thessalonians is only plus 20. 1 Corinthians, the date's been coming back on 1 Corinthians now. I used to say 55, 56. Now it's come back to about 53, 54. It's about 23 to 24 years after the cross. And in this book, that's 23 years after the cross, Paul specifically says, I gave you what I was given as of first importance. Now, he says that twice. Once in 1 Corinthians 11 on the communion or Eucharistic passage, and the other one is in 1 Corinthians 15. And there's another reference in that book to passing on tradition. There's three of them. But first of all, the book is already plus 23, 24. Paul says, this is not my material. He says, after defining the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2, he says, I'm giving you what I was given. So you already know it's earlier because Paul got it. You go, well, that doesn't mean that was before his conversion. How do you know back then? And I would say, okay, time out. Almost everybody, there's a number of people, I can give you names if you want. Richard Bauckham's an example. All theologians, you almost can't find one who doesn't put that creed in the first 3 years or so after the cross. It's pre-Pauline. But here's the point. I'm not going to die for the date of the creed. Everyone's going to grant it to me, but I won't die for the date of the creed. When Paul went to the other apostles, the chief ones in Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2, and then in 1 Corinthians 15:11, when he says we're all preaching the same thing, that they saw Jesus, I'm not so much interested in the date of the creed, although that will stand the test. I'm interested in Paul saying, I got this material from those who saw him. And it's in Galatians 1, it's again in Galatians 2, it's again in 1 Corinthians 15:11. 3 times we're told that he was speaking the words of the eyewitnesses. That's the key. What was reported, not that it was reported in a creedal fashion. Although, as I said, that too makes the test.
And what about the appearances to the 500? Do a lot of scholars accept that? Do they think that Paul, it's just made up, or?
Okay. The appearance of the 500 is recorded only in the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, there are some places in the Gospels where it could have happened. I mean, where it could fit in. For example, when Jesus appears on a mountainside in Galilee, he fed 5,000 at one time. And by the way, there it says 5,000 men. If you're going to count women and children, that's going to be a huge crowd. If there's room for 5,000 or more somewhere, there's certainly room for 500 somewhere. And he appears on a mountainside. So there are places it could go. But nonetheless, appearing to the 500, that's the only time it's mentioned. Now, how many people say it's just rank legend or something? Not really many on the average. I've got a buddy who surveys Jesus Seminar people. Now, for you folks from Europe, Jesus Seminars are mostly American invention, and the Europeans often tease it. They're the Americans. They're not only Americans, but they're largely Americans, and they throw beads in a hat. They vote on whether Jesus said the so-called red letter words in the Gospels, and they reject. They're very skeptical. They reject, depending on how you count the colors, they reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. They're quite skeptical. And this friend of mine, he makes a habit of emailing the Jesus Seminar members, asking them where they are. And he'll say to them, one of the questions he asks them is, what do you say about the appearance, about hallucinations? Couldn't hallucinations be the reason? And they'll say, no, because the appearance to the 500 disproves it. And that's what they'll say. But I can also tell you, and that's a pretty good number. I'm not trying to say they all believe that, they don't, but I will tell you this, the Jesus Seminar, that skeptical group, they count it red. Red is the color for it this occurred. And they count the appearance to Paul as red. They count the appearance to Peter as pink. And they say, and pink is probably. And they say the only reason we say probably for Peter is that it's in the creed. We didn't hear that from Peter himself. We heard it from Paul himself, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15, but we didn't hear from Peter. So that's pink. And they say, we also think Jesus appeared to the women. And they've got that creed. And by the way, the Jesus Seminar voted that creed is pre-Pauline. The Jesus Seminar conceded that the 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following creed was in existence before Paul was converted. So again, that's fantastic, but we're more interested in the data, not the data of the creed itself.
Right.
But I would just add, so I was clear about this, Bauckham and the others, they repeat that it is now a consensus view. It's a consensus view in the New Testament that those creeds were pre-Pauline and go back to the very beginning. That is now the New Testament position.
Wow. All right. Well, does anyone else have any questions? You can either type them in the chat or just feel free to unmute yourself. All right. Well, we have a couple more questions here. These are maybe a little bit off topic of the resurrection slightly, but someone was wondering about can we actually make a historical case that there were 12 disciples? How solid can that a case be made for that?
Okay, now, do you think the question is, do we have their names, or do you think the question is the number 12 holy, or how specific do we get?
No, more like just the number 12, I think. Is that likely to be historical?
Yeah, 12 is what's reported in the Gospels, and but here's a stronger reason. You have Jesus going out and choosing these people, but in the Creed, in 1 Corinthians 15, which is pre-Pauline, it specifically says the words again, I delivered unto you that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that he appeared to Peter and the 12. So at that very early point, the 12 as a group shows up in the creed. But we know there's more than 12 as far as major followers, because that creed also says he showed himself to the 12, and he has showed himself to all the apostles, which is a larger group. That's probably going to be people like James, Paul, the women. And then you got the 500 in the same creed. You have three groups in the creed: the 12, all the apostles, and the 500. So there's certainly a lot more than 12. But I'm just saying the fact that that word 12 was recorded in the earliest creed is very strong evidence for that number, and the fact that there was a core of that many.
And also, here's another question. I think this is sort of related to that the disciples were willing to die for their
Okay.
beliefs. And they're asking about the persecution in the early church. How strong is the evidence that early Christians were persecuted? Do even any scholars deny that they were persecuted?
Do you mean were they just the general belief that they were persecuted?
Yeah, that's what this person's asking.
Yeah, pretty strong. Okay, now let me give some caveats. A lot of Christians act like the worst persecution in Christian history was around the time of Nero, because he traditionally, according to tradition, had Peter crucified, had Paul beheaded. It was just a horrible time for Christians. There were more widespread crucifixions than that. In fact, it could be argued that the strongest time for crucifixion came uh, just before. The book of Psalms says, weeping is at night, joy comes in the morning. Well, just before Constantine uh, declared Christianity to be the empire's religion, just before that, the strongest persecution arguably came at the late 200s and early 300s, before that edict was made. So it's not going to be the worst persecution. But the fact that there were persecutions, I already gave another reason. Three of the big four, Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, we have first century sources for their martyrdoms. We have first century sources and multiple New Testament writers, early writers, about the persecution in their regions. So there's no reason to doubt the persecutions or the disciples. Now, there is a question about how far you can prove the apostles became martyrs. I think we should not say flippantly, "Oh yeah, and all 12 of them, or all 12 of them, but John were were martyred." We shouldn't say that, because you're going to be citing late sources before you get them all dying as martyrs. I don't think we should go that route. I think what you can say is they were all willing to die, and somebody could say, "Well, how can you judge their motives?" You go, "What do you mean?" You say they're willing to die. Yeah, well, I'm not judging their motives. I'm judging their feet, what they do. They kept going back in the same places where they were beat up. Why do you keep going to the same town if you were beat up there, or in the region where you were beat up? Why do you go back there? Because there's a job to do. There are people who came to Christ. I want more to come to Christ. So what you're saying is you take evangelism more seriously than you take your own life. That's being willing to die. So it just assumes that there was major persecution going on somewhere. We have a lot of witnesses for that. But like I said, the best I would think is that 3 of the 4 big names we have first century sources for their martyrdom.
All right. I was wondering about if you could talk about NDEs a little bit, because maybe you've given someone the case for the resurrection. They think it's strong, but they just don't want to believe that there's anything beyond just this life. So, can you talk a little bit about just the evidence you found in NDEs and how you can use that in an overall case for the resurrection?
Yeah, I think they go hand in glove, because you could either argue from NDEs that there's an afterlife, therefore you should be more open to afterlife accounts of which the resurrection is one, or it can happen the other way. You give evidence for the resurrection, the person says, yeah, but you want me not only to believe there's a resurrection, we don't know about these, but you want me to believe in another world too. And I could go that way with NDEs. There's a lot of ways I can go here, but I've done some publishing. Um, if you want to write me an email, I'll send you a chapter that, and I'm doing another one that should be out any time, a more in-depth one. But I had a chapter published in a debate book by Blackwell out of Oxford. They claim to be the most scholarly press in the world. Um, and I published an article in a book on the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. I think that's the name of it. Let me get it right here in a second. I'm just leaning right. I just happen to have it right here. Yeah, the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, and I have a chapter in there on NDEs. And the key thing is, uh, there are over 300 evidenced cases of NDEs today. Actually, the number's going up pretty fast. We're getting, closer to 400 that I know of. But there are dozens of these where the evidence they cite, such as I was in the operating room, but I watched my family 3 floors away in the hospital, and Bob said something very odd. Bob said, um, uh, "Oh, blah 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 blah," and I said later, "Bob, I heard you say this," and he goes, "Only the people in the room heard that." Yeah, that's my point. I was in the room. No, you were in surgery. No, I heard it. And they report things that can be verified. And some of these things can be verified with a lot of data, like a police report or something. Well, the point is, there are 36 of these reports where there's no known, no registered heart or brain activity. No heart or brain activity. And there's confirmation. Now, in some of this, if I told you what they were, some of them were no heart, no brain, different kinds of confirmation, different places, miles away. Miles, maybe your relatives are in a home 2 miles from the hospital. And it was emergency and they didn't even know what was that going on. So there's highly evidence NDEs like that, so much so that even more than resurrection, anymore critics feel compelled to admit. So some naturalists I understand are saying this. All right, I think I can still stay a naturalist here, but I'm going to be a naturalist who believes in an afterlife. Well, A.J. Ayer, the famous British naturalist, British atheist, he had 2 near-death experiences before he died. And he wouldn't say he saw God. He wouldn't say I saw God. He said, I stood before a being that he called something like the superintendent of the universe, but he wouldn't call him God. If and he said it was an unpleasant experience. And when he came back, he said, I'm slightly more open to an afterlife. Slightly? You were there. In fact, the name of the article is called, I think the exact title is What I Saw When I Was Dead. Whoa, time out. When you're dead, you're not supposed to see anything, not even an hallucination. You're not even supposed to have hallucinations when you're dead, according to your view. So I think naturalisms are being, they're strongly under fire today from NDEs alone. I could give more email. I could give you more examples if you want. If you want to hear if you want real evidences of kind of things they report that are verified. That's not hard. That's very easy. In fact, I could send you, if I send you that essay, I give about 20 examples in there that are verified, but there are
And
way more than that.
okay, and where can you find that essay?
Actually, it's online. I'm told someone sent it to me. It's in the Blackwell Companion to Mind to Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. I believe that's the exact title. The Blackwell Companion. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll just hold it up. Here's the book. The Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. It's huge. It's 500 pages ish. And there are debates in here. There's a bunch of debates, generally between atheists and theists. It's not a Christian book per se, but it's a debate on whether there is, whether dualism is true. And so they asked me to do a chapter, and I debate a guy. Actually, the guy I debated is a Christian. He had 3 earned doctor's degrees. He was a Christian. He just doesn't like near-death experiences. And so we debated, and that's how this started. I mean, I've had publications out there for 20 years, but what I mean is this particular debate where I try to give these 300 reasons is in there. So it's in the Blackwell. I think you can find it online. The Blackwell, it's very expensive, but the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. And there's an article in there, chapter 14 or chapter 15, Gary Habermas, Evidential Near-Death Experience is the name of it.
Great. I want to be respectful for your time, so I'll just leave you one more question if that's okay.
Sure.
So for people who maybe haven't investigated the resurrection before, where would you recommend they start? What are some books you'd recommend?
If you want to go into it hook, line, and sinker, I mean, the whole thing, I would recommend Mike Lacona's dissertation, which is called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. I think that's the name of it. It's InterVarsity Academic. Also, Tom Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, published in both the UK and the US by Fortress in the US. And those two, if you want a more technical, Mike Lacona's was a PhD dissertation at a secular university. And if you want to go come down a little bit and not be that technical, Mike and I have a co-authored book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And it's 400 or 450 pages, something like that. And that lays it out a little more easily graspable, put it that way. So Mike Lacona's big one is the best one out there. It's on evidence. I'd say Tom Wright's is next on evidence. I'd say the smaller one by Mike and me, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, would be the best if what you want is not something that's a PhD dissertation.
Great. Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're going to call it a night, but thank you so much, Dr. Habermas, for joining us and for your presentation.
Glad to be with you. I enjoyed it. Again, I'm sorry for those long answers, but I know when you don't give long answers, someone's going to walk away and go, well, I think he should have given more detail because he didn't answer this question or that question. So it did get kind of involved, but I enjoyed being with you very much.
All right. Thanks so much. And everyone who's part of Reasonable Faith, just stick around for a minute. We'll chat a little bit, but for the rest of you, thanks again, Dr. Habermas, and thanks for coming. And I'll see you all again.
Not a problem. Thank you for the opportunity. First time I've ever been in Helsinki, virtually. So appreciate the opportunity. Y'all have a good night.